Hello everyone and welcome back to the Science Corner. My name is Dr. Taylor Ireland with an imaginary PhD in evolutionary processes, and this is my associate Wilson. Today we'll be explaining the concept of natural selection to 4 different levels, ranging from an elementary school student to an expert in the field. What do you say, Wilson? Should we get right into it? Let's go. Our first guest today is Justin, who is clearly a 5th grade student. So Justin, do you ever wonder how humans evolved from monkeys or how dogs evolved from wolves?
Yeah, I do.
Well, this process is called evolution. Do you know what this is?
No.
Evolution is the process of living organisms developing into other organisms over time, which occurs through something called natural selection, what is what I am here to talk to you about today. Do you know what natural selection is?
No.
I will explain natural selection to you by telling you a story. A long time ago, frogs lived in a green river. Some of the frogs were purple and some were green. The purple frogs appeared after the green frogs because of a mistake that happened when their genes were passed down from their parents. Do you know what genes are?
Yeah, genes make up DNA, right?
Wow, that is very impressive. Anyways, this mistake caused the frog to turn purple. The purple frog had babies, which were also purple. Originally, there were more green frogs than purple frogs since the green frogs could fit into the green river better and hide from snakes which wanted to eat them. One day, someone accidentally spilled purple dye into the water, turning the whole river purple. As shown in this picture, what do you think happened to the purple frogs and what happened to the green frogs in the purple river?
I think that more of the purple frogs lived and all of the green frogs died because the purple frogs camouflage better in the purple river.
Great job! Which one do you think will the snake eat?
The snake will eat the green frog because they are easier to see in the purple river.
You are right. This process is called natural selection. Since the purple frogs had a higher chance of not being eaten by the snake, more of them survived, eventually causing all the frogs to be purple instead of green, as all the green frogs got eaten. Now, only purple frogs exist. Overall, the frogs evolved to be able to survive better in their environment through the process of
natural selection.
Great job! Hi, Andrea. It's nice to meet you. You're in grade 12, correct?
Yes, I am in grade 12, currently attending high school.
Well, today I'm here to talk to you about a process called natural selection. Do you know what this is?
I know a little bit about natural selection, but I could use a review.
Perfect. Well, before I explain, I think I'm going to tell you about the peppered moths and the Industrial Revolution. So, before the Industrial Revolution, the majority of peppered moths were white with black spots, while only a small percentage were fully black. Scientists have discovered that a genetic mutation occurred to the peppered moth species, thus adding a new gene into the population for the black phenotype. And a phenotype is essentially the physical appearance of an organism from its genetic makeup. This caused genetic diversity within the peppered moth species population. Do you know what genetic diversity is?
Yes, genetic diversity is the number of genetic characteristics in a species. We learned about this concept in the population dynamics unit.
Great, yes, that's correct. It's also important to note that genetic diversity causes a greater survival of species, as the diversity allows for a better ability to adapt to an environment change or something such as a disease. The Industrial Revolution caused black soot from coal-burning factories to stick to the bark of trees. Over time, there's an increase in the phenotype for the black peppered moth and decrease in the white moth phenotype with black spots. Since the black moth was able to fit better into its surrounding, which was the black tree, and hide from predators, while the white moth was more visible on the black tree. Now, there are more black moths than white moths with black spots, as shown in this diagram with a black tree. Ultimately, natural selection is the process of organisms becoming better adapted to their environment, which allows them to have a higher chance of survival. How do you think this story relates to natural selection?
The moth example demonstrates natural selection as the peppered moth species adapted to the changing environment over time. As the number of black peppered moths increased to accompany the increased number of trees with black soot.
Another important thing to understand is the importance of genetic mutations in natural selection. A genetic mutation can either have no effect, be positive, or negative. Do you know what a genetic mutation is?
Yes, I learned about this in my genetics unit. A genetic mutation is the alteration of a nucleotide sequence.
Very good job. If the genetic mutation is positive, it is more likely to stay in the population as it serves an evolutionary purpose for the species. An example of this is polar bears. Polar bears actually evolved from the grizzly bear species. Scientists believe grizzly bears found their way to colder climates during a warm season and got trapped in the cold season, thus being forced to adapt to the climate. A genetic mutation occurred, causing hollow hair that appears white, and eventually this mutation was passed down to offspring because of its evolutionary advantage for living in the Arctic. Secondly, scientists suggest that a genetic mutation also occurred in the ApoB gene, which essentially codes for the protein known as bad cholesterol or low-density lipid protein. This mutation allowed for polar bears to consume blubbery foods such as seal, which are available in the Arctic without obtaining fatty deposits in arteries.
Since both of these mutations were positive and allowed the polar bear to better adapt to their environment, they sustained in the population.
You are correct. And that's all for now, but thank you so much for coming in today. I'm joined here now with Steve, who is a college student studying biology. So Steve, do you know what natural selection is?
Yes, natural selection is the process of organisms better adapting to their environment.
Correct. More specifically, an organism with a beneficial trait is able to thrive better in its environment while the other organisms of that species with different traits decrease in population numbers as they do not have the same advantage for survival. Sometimes these beneficial traits are caused by genetic mutations that occur. Mutations can either be positive, negative, or have no effect. A genetic mutation occurs when a nucleotide is misplaced in a DNA sequence during DNA replication. A genetic mutation could potentially result in the introduction of a new allele to the population. Do you know what would happen in result of a new allele?
Yes, I believe a new allele would result in a different genotype and phenotype being introduced into a species population, resulting in a genetic mutation.
Correct, and genetic mutations within a species can lead to genetic diversity. So, first scenario, let's say a change happened to an environment. In this situation, do you think it would be more beneficial to have either a lower or higher genetic diversity within the population?
It would be more beneficial to have a higher genetic diversity within the population, since it's more likely one of the many phenotypes would be suited for the new environment rather than having one or two phenotypes which have a lower probability of being suited to the environment.
Very good. Moving on, are you aware of how natural selection is linked to evolution, as it is considered to be a mechanism of evolution?
Yes, natural selection is the process of organisms becoming better adapted to their environment, thus allowing them to have a higher chance of survival. This process would ultimately lead to divergence and speciation, forming new organisms and species within, which is essentially what evolution is.
Great job. There are also other mechanisms of evolution, including gene flow and genetic drift. Essentially, gene flow is the process of movement of individuals or their gametes, which is egg or sperm, leading to the flow of genes in or out of a population. Gene flow can bring new alleles or already existing alleles in new proportions to the new population, ultimately leading to change in dynamics. Secondly, genetic drift is also a mechanism of evolution which causes a change to occur in allele frequency as a result of random events. Genetic drift generally has a larger effect on smaller population sizes. Two ways genetic drift can occur is through the founder or bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect is essentially the drastic decrease in the size of a population, which is generally caused by an event such as a natural disaster or disease spread. In this event, random genes are removed from a population, overall decreasing the genetic diversity in the gene pool. On the other hand, founder effect occurs when a population is established by individuals that originate from another bigger population, however, without the same level of genetic diversity as the last. Ultimately, this leads to the new population to have a less genetic diversity and become isolated from the other population. And this is the example of founder effect and bottleneck.
It's very interesting that there are multiple mechanisms of evolution. I was unaware of these.
Yes, it is quite fascinating to learn about them all. To conclude, what are the two mechanisms I talked about?
Genetic drift and gene flow.
Great job! Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Today, I am joined here with Dr. Ela Conti, who is unfortunately unable to be with us in person as she is conducting research on individuals with sickle cell anemia in Africa. Welcome, Ela.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
As you are aware, today we'll be discussing the topic of natural selection, specifically focusing on sickle cell anemia by looking at a research study conducted in 2015. Before we get into the study, I thought we could discuss the basis of sickle cell anemia and mutations.
Yeah, sickle cell anemia is a genetic mutation, specifically a base substitution resulting in the addition of a different amino acid in protein synthesis. This mutation occurs in the HB gene. The allele for sickle cell anemia is HBS, while the normal allele is HBA. Essentially, the amino acid change results in a sickle-shaped red blood cell that is unable to carry oxygen as effectively, ultimately why this mutation poses many risks to the individual affected.
Yes, and as we will discuss later, being heterozygous for the HB gene, meaning having both the HBS and HBA allele, provides some advantages. In the article titled "Malaria Continues to Select for Sickle Cell Trait in Central Africa," the results of a study conducted on 4,359 participants sampled from 220 random villages in Gabon were published and analyzed.
I believe the results stated that 21.7% of the individuals were heterozygous for the gene, while no samples tested had the HBSS genotype, thus confirming the high mortality of this mutation.
I was surprised to see over 1/5 of the population had the HBSA genotype, overall proving how prevalent this trait is in this region. Just to give you an idea of how a heterozygous genotype works, we have an example here with a parent having HBA and HBA, and then one parent being heterozygous. The offspring has a 50% chance of also being heterozygous for the sickle cell anemia trait. In the end, the overall conclusion was that there is a very strong tie between being heterozygous for the sickle cell anemia gene and malaria. The association specifically between asymptomatic individuals who had malaria and the heterozygous trait. Essentially, this study confirmed that the positive effects of being heterozygous for the sickle cell anemia gene. It makes sense that the HBS is predominantly present in areas with a high risk of malaria infection, such as in Central Africa.
Overall, this allele has sustained itself in the population and has not been eliminated over time, as being heterozygous for the gene provides survival advantages regarding protection against malaria.
To conclude, this relates to natural selection, as the mutation that caused sickle cell anemia sustained in the population as it was positive and provided advantages for those who are carriers of the gene. That's all for today, but thank you for coming. Thanks so much for sticking around to learn about natural selection and applications of natural selection. Overall, I was very impressed with everyone's general knowledge of natural selection, aside from younger levels who were slightly less experienced with their knowledge, as expected. I hope you viewers learned something during my explanations, and please let me know if you have any ideas for future explanations and video ideas. That's all for today, and I'll see you next time on the Science Corner.